because Swinburne basically takes the view that from our conception of love that we've understood within our human context, we then can derive the Trinity. What I'm trying to say is, from the conception of love that's revealed to us from Holy Scripture, we can then derive the Trinity. And so Revelation is part of that. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a certain type of love that's fixed in the Bible, and that certain type of love then allows us to then derive the other two persons from the Father. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a solely a priori exercise, which I would say the Catholic Church would say you can't do. You can't just say, from sitting on my couch on a Sunday morning, I can come to the Trinity just thinking about the idea of love. Yeah. Because that's what Swinburne's argument is sort of trying to say. What I'm trying to say is, from a certain type of love that's being revealed, agapeic love, we can then derive the Trinity from that. And so it's from reason and revelation, not just reason alone. Yeah, but you need the revelation to come first, right? Oh, yes, 100%. Yeah. Okay, so, and then on that point, so I agree that Scripture presents it that way as far as how God's love is, and I haven't read the paper, but I think I get the gist of what you're saying. But I'm wondering what your position is on what's called the doctrine of no real relations, that God is not really related to the world. What's your position on that? Because it seems to me the classical position actually negates the concept of love that you're talking about, because God doesn't actually really love us in the way that we perceive love. Love, what Aquinas says, love is simply just to will the good of another. And it doesn't seem like that's the case to me, because there's no intentional act, there's no directedness at the individual in which you are loving that individual. And if that is how it's being framed as part of the agape love argument, then it contradicts that doctrine. Not only that, it seems to me that it actually undermines St. Augustine's understanding of the Trinity. Why do I say that? Because his analogy to the Trinity is a human being, and analogizes it to God, actually loving himself rather than loving another. And so that's another issue. And then leading on from that, I'm not trying to pile on too much, but Dale Tuggy, as I'm sure you know, makes a distinction between OneSelf and three-self Trinitarian views. It seems to me that this type of argument assumes a three-self Trinitarian view, such that it not only says that Unitarianism is not a viable option, or I don't know how far you want to push it, whether it's a plausibility argument or it's meant to say that it's completely incoherent. I think it also would do this, whatever that argument is meant to conclude with, would do the exact same thing for any OneSelf Trinitarian models, such as Augustine and Aquinas, etc. Not to throw, I'm going to be the paper guy, throwing too many papers at you. But there is just starting with your first point about the real relations issue. There's a paper that was in the same journal as that love argument, called the Metaphysics of Theism, where I try and reconcile how someone can affirm a classical view of God and a neoclassical view of God without contradiction. I saw you had a video on that. I was watching some of it, but I didn't get to watch the whole thing. So anyway, the whole point of doing all of that is because relative to whatever, the classical view of God, you can hold to God not being really related to us in that specific way of being, way of existence. Yet you can still affirm God being really related to us through his neoclassical way of being. Now, that's going to take a lot of time to unpack. So, So I don't want to go into that. So that's what I'm saying about papers. But I would refer, yourself or anyone else who's interested in that. I think there is ways to affirm God not being really related, so still having that. So if someone didn't have that other aspect and just affirmed what seems to be the purely classical view, then would that be problematic? Maybe, I mean, I'm open to that. But I don't think I'm not saying that the metaphysics, someone has to absorb the metaphysics I'm trying to push to reconcile these two positions. But I think... No. What I'm saying is I think the argument assumes that type of metaphysics, such that if you don't accept that, the arguments won't work.
Yeah. So I'm saying that I would say that I'm open to other ways of people reconciling it, but I would say unless there's reason to go against the metaphysical sort of view that I'm putting to make sense of how you can reconcile these two things, then I don't see the problem. But yes, I think maybe a classical theistic view of God without any way of having a neoclassical understanding might have this problem. Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, I'm not saying from an outsider perspective. I'm saying within the Trinitarian camp, I think that many people would have a problem with that because they wouldn't want to affirm the distinction you're making, and I don't want to get into it, but the whole abstract concrete thing, and I think that they would have a problem with it. And I can't prove it, but it just seems on a straightforward basis. I don't think that the church fathers thought of it in that way. I think they thought of it in this classical way, and they were against the neoclassical picture. Now, I know that you're trying to synthesize them, but I'm saying, back to an earlier point, if we're trying to take the history, and especially as a Catholic, trying to take the history and tradition of the church seriously, I do see that as something that's novel, that is not in continuity with what the church fathers taught.
The something I tried to bring out in the paper in that interview as well was the methodology itself is not novel, because it's just the qua methodology that you find with duplicative predication where, with Christ, qua is human nature, qua is divine nature, he has these attributes. I'm doing the exact same thing, but I'm just applying it within a different context. But I think also the metaphysics that I utilize, so ontological pluralism, which has been really forwarded by Chris McDaniel, he shows in its work that actually it's a historically grounded position that fell out of favor, and then he's sort of trying to bring it back into favor. So it is something that's there. I would agree with you. Application of it is novel, but that's not problematic. Because what I'm trying to do anyway, because the whole point of the paper was trying to say, I call them traditionalists, and I say someone who holds to the authority of Scripture and someone who holds to the authority of tradition has a bit of a contradiction. Because Scripture says God is neoclassical, and tradition says he is classical. What are we supposed to do? So I'm saying you have a problem there. But what will normally happen is that someone would say, well, actually, Scripture doesn't say, is not a neoclassical understanding. And blah, blah, blah.
Or they'll say that it appears that way, but it's written in such a way for you to understand it that way, but God is not actually that way. So what I'm saying is, I think that many classical theists, specifically in the Catholic tradition, would have an issue with your presentation of it. Now, that I'm not saying that means that it's false. That's not what I'm arguing. But I'm saying, per impossibility, if we were able to resurrect Aquinas or even Augustine and have them here, I don't think that they would be accepting of it. Even though you say, well, look, guys, I'm using the qua move and I'm just applying it in a different sense, they would say, sorry, Josh, you're misapplying it.
But not to argue with the dead Aquinas, but I think Aquinas would take the methodology of let's look at its veracity. If there's problems with it, then don't go with it. But just because the application might be new, doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. Specifically as a Catholic, because the understanding of Catholicism is that tradition is alive. So it's not like, so maybe an Eastern Orthodox might have more of a problem because there is a great, sort of emphasis on the first millennium. That's when everything sort of shut down, and after that we don't have any more councils and blah, blah, blah. So if it's not in the first millennium, no. But Catholics might not. They would say we prioritize the first millennium, but necessarily doesn't mean that you cannot have developments in place later on. And so maybe this development in methodology or application of methodology is something that needs to be had. Because what I'm trying to say is, at face value, we can take Scripture at face value. We can take tradition at face value. With our latest metaphysics, we can do this sort of reconciliation. Okay, not to to move off this point and go to something you were saying about the three self and one self.
And Saint Augustine's understanding of the analogy he gives is God loving himself, not God loving another.
Okay, now, interestingly, the actual argument that I give in that paper is not predicated on a one-self or three-self. It can actually be applied in a one-self context because it utilizes the idea of duplication. So it's the idea that the Father is in a relation with a duplicate of him, and the Son, the Father and the Son, are in a relationship with a duplicate of each other. Now, this duplication, it could be that there is a numerical distinction between them or not. So you could affirm a numerical distinction and say the duplicate is numerically distinct but qualitatively identical. Or
But then you're going to have to do something with classical identity in that aspect.
Yeah, no, again, not paper bashing, but there's one paper which is going to be interesting, and I'll like to, when it ever does come out, if it ever does come out, but it's been under review for like forever. But there's a paper where I actually flip the script and I try and argue from a OneSelf view and try to show how the logical problem of the Trinity, you can have a OneSelf view and affirm all the things that the tenets of the logical problem normally bring without falling into contradiction. And I actually say the Father, Son, and the Spirit are numerically identical.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to have a OneSelf view, especially based on the biblical portrayal of the relationship between the Father and the Son. And not only that, the problem of indexicals, which I've brought up to Bo in the past, and I don't know if you followed the ongoing argument between Scott Williams and William Hasker. I think Hasker has made significant and very strong points, and it's actually something I discuss in my course where I go through that. So, I mean, most people probably have no idea what we're talking about, but
I think everyone's left.
Yeah, everybody left.
Everyone's like, what's good on here?
Yeah. So, but my point is, I think there are very strong arguments against a OneSelf view, and so because of that, I don't really see it as a viable option. I
mean, I affirm a free self view personally, but what I was trying to show is that if we were to take a OneSelf view, I don't believe there's a problem there. That's what I'm trying to show them. But personally, I'll probably go with a free self view. But no. I mean, I don't. The argument I'm giving from love, that specific one, I don't believe it's wedded to a three self view, even though Swinburne's is. So Swinburne's is wedded to a three self view. But the one I'm trying to push, I don't believe it is. It's sort of quiet on the matter.
And you have you put the paper out already on that?
Yeah.
So if you can just send me that.
I will send it.
And then I do have to run.
Yeah, we can catch up more.
If I could squeeze in one last question.
Yes.
I'm just going to give him one last question, and I actually have to run. So this idea of God as a necessary being, right? It seems to me that in your discussion with Mullins, and that you take sort of a Swinburnian view in which God isn't necessary, including the Father. That's the way that I understood it. Specifically on your whole analogy of the intrinsic properties of God and what you consider the great-making properties. To me, all of those scenarios, like the example you gave of the lonely rock existing, right? It assumes that God isn't necessary because there's a possibility in which he doesn't exist, and all you have is the lonely rock, right? So just for clarity's sake, what is your position on that? And does part of your argument for trying to show that aseity cannot be an intrinsic property is inherent within that classification of those attributes, assume that God is not logically necessary?
No, just going with the second point first. I don't think it does, and I'm still, because I've had this issue with trying to understand Ryan's objection as well.
Yeah, but do you get what I'm trying to say?
I get what you're trying to say. But I'm trying to understand the objection, because the point is just the idea that if we take, an intrinsic property to be one that's not dependent upon our situation. So whatever object has a property, if that property is not dependent upon the situation, the external situation of that object, then it's an internal it's internal, intrinsic property.
Intrinsic,
But if it is dependent in some way upon its situation, then it's extrinsic property.
Right,
And so what Lewis tries to do, so David Lewis tries to do with his lonely object thing, is trying to say, well, if a property can be had by a lonely object and can be had by an accompanied object, and if it can be lacked by a lonely object and lacked by an accompanying object, then it's an intrinsic property. So it's just trying to say the property itself, not the object, but can the property itself be had or lacked? And is it dependent upon its environment or not? If it can be had or lacked and it's not dependent upon its environment, then it's intrinsic. And so what I'm trying to say to you with the property of arseity, it is not like that, because it is dependent upon its environment. Because if an entity, so not God, but if an entity is arse, so that means it's not dependent upon anything else, and it's not caused by anything else, can it be had by an accompanying object? Yes. But can it be lacked by a lonely object? No. Because for it to be lacked, that means that it has to have a cause.
Yeah.
So, but for it to have a cause, it has to be accompanied by something that causes it.
Yeah.
And so, but now, what I wanted to bring up as well is that with Ryan, there was also a misconception had with essential and intrinsic. So,
yeah, I recognize that.
So
I'm not trying to make that point.
So, with the intrinsic property of, for example, of omnipotence, omnipotence is an intrinsic property. Yeah. Because an entity can have it can lack it, lonely or accompanied. But arseity is not like that, because it can't have it it can't lack it, when it's unaccompanied, when it's lonely.
Yeah.
So there's a distinction to be had between those properties. So for me, it's nothing to do with God being necessary, him himself.
I think it is, though, because in order for that example to even work, that has to be a genuine possibility. Otherwise, you're just spouting meaningless words, in a sense. So what I'm saying is, if God is logically necessary, and I'm not saying that you have to take that view, but if God is logically necessary, then that scenario in which God doesn't exist, because he doesn't exist in that situation, which you have a lonely rock that exists alone and is arse. It's only the rock, right? So if that is a genuine possibility, how could God be logically necessary? You should be able to derive a contradiction from that scenario.
I mean, I'm not. If it is entailing that God can't be logically necessary, I don't have a
meaning
problem.
in the sense of ontological argument, a strong ontological argument. If you're using a strong ontological argument to say that God is logically necessary, not merely metaphysically necessary, or even if you wanted to say something less than that and say he's contingent. So it seems to me that in order to use those examples, they assume that a lonely rock existing arse is a genuine possibility, because if it's not, then that's not a possible world, because God exists in every possible world.